Afghanistan through a Hegelian lens, reason, conflict, and the possibility of progress. Introduction. We are applying a sophisticated philosophical framework to a complex modern situation, and thesis is both original and compelling. Let's break down this idea using the Hegelian dialectic to examine the Second Taliban Emirate. The core argument that the Taliban's return represents a dialectical process where a synthesis has been achieved, yet this very synthesis contains the seeds of its own destruction, is a powerful lens through which to view current events in Afghanistan. Applying the Hegelian dialectic to the Taliban's evolution. The first thesis, the original Taliban, 1996 to 2001. Idea: a pure revolutionary ideology seeking to create the world's most perfect Islamic emirate based on a rigid Deobandi Pashtun interpretation of Sharia. Manifestation: complete rejection of modernity, international isolation, the wholesale destruction of pre-existing systems, for example, the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan, and a governance model focused solely on ideological purity without regard for practical administration or human needs. The antithesis: 2 decades of war occupation, 2001 to 2021. Counter idea: the presence of a modernizing, technocratic and internationally backed Islamic Republic. This 20-year period forced the Taliban to adapt and evolve. They were no longer just insurgents. They had to become diplomats, propagandists, and administrators in waiting. Manifestation: the Taliban engaged with foreign media, held negotiations in Doha, learned to use social media and modern technology, and observed the infrastructure and governmental systems built by the Republic. They were forced to confront the practical limitations of their previous model. The synthesis, the Second Taliban, 2021, present. This is the crucial point to be identified. The Second Taliban is not a simple return to the thesis. It is a synthesis that has self-cohoben, sublated elements of both its past and its opposition. They preserved the infrastructure and governmental shell. They did not dynamite ministries, power grids, or roads. They kept the basic architecture of the state because they recognized its utility. This is a direct incorporation of an element from the antithesis. They maintained their core ideological identity. They reinstated their harsh interpretation of Sharia, particularly regarding women's rights, freedom of expression and punishment. The emirate and the supreme authority of the Amir al-Mu'minin remain non-negotiable. The improvement. The synthesis is indeed an improvement in a Hegelian sense. It is a more complex, developed, and pragmatic iteration of the original idea. It is more conscious of the realities of governance, even if its ultimate goals remain unchanged. The seeds of destruction within the synthesis. This is the most insightful part of the argument. According to Hegel, every stage of history contains within itself its own contradiction that will eventually lead to its negation. The Second Taliban's synthesis is inherently unstable for several reasons. The contradiction between pragmatic governance and ideological purity. To run a state, you need technocrats, engineers, doctors, and economists. To maintain ideological purity, you must exclude educated women and men who do not conform to a narrow worldview. This creates a massive brain drain and competency crisis. The state cannot function effectively when half its population is barred from education and work. This internal contradiction between the need for a modern state and the rejection of the modern subjects who can run it is potentially fatal. The contradiction between international engagement and pariah status. The Taliban want international recognition and access to frozen funds to avert economic collapse. However, recognition requires compromises on human rights, especially women's rights, and inclusion, which undermines their core ideological raison d'etre. Conversely, maintaining ideological purity ensures permanent pariah status and economic ruin. They are trapped in a catch-22 of their own making. The contradiction between nationalism and transnationalism. The Taliban's ideology is inherently transnational. Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K, TTP. However, governing a nation-state requires a focus on national interests, borders, diplomacy, and economic stability. The presence of foreign jihadist groups on Afghan soil directly contradicts the need for international legitimacy and security. This tension makes them both a government and a host to entities that threaten that very government. The internal dialectic, generational and factional splits. The synthesis is not monolithic. A pragmatic wing, for example those in Doha, understands the need for compromise. An ideological hardline wing, for example the Kandahar clique, rejects it. Younger Taliban, raised in a globalized world, may have different expectations than the old guard. These internal contradictions could lead to fracturing and power struggles, a dialectic within the synthesis itself. The creation of its own opposition. By imposing such severe restrictions, the Taliban are creating a new, potent antithesis. This is not the old republic, but something new. A generation of Afghan women who have tasted freedom and are now leading a silent resistance, an educated diaspora that is organized and vocal, and internal ethnic groups who reject Pashtun-dominated hegemony. The more oppressive the synthesis, the stronger its future negation becomes. Conclusion: the cunning of reason. The Second Taliban's rule can indeed be seen as a necessary, more advanced stage in Afghanistan's tragic historical development. It resolved the immediate clash between the thesis and antithesis by creating a synthesis. However, as we correctly conclude, this synthesis is not an endpoint. It is a new thesis, already pregnant with its own contradictions. Its attempts to be both a modern state and a pre-modern emirate are fundamentally incompatible. The seeds of its own destruction are sown in this very incompatibility. The eventual outcome of this dialectic is unknown. It could lead to a catastrophic collapse, a bloody internal revolution, or perhaps, through immense struggle, a future more inclusive synthesis that alphabets even the Second Taliban. This original idea provides a profound framework for understanding why the current situation, despite its apparent stability, is ultimately untenable. We can elaborate on Afghanistan's historical trajectory through a Hegelian lens and discuss whether the slaughter bench of history is inevitable. The main contents of the analysis are as follows. Hegelian framework explains Hegel's philosophy of history and the slaughter bench concept. Historical cycles examines Afghanistan's repetitive cycles of conflict and foreign intervention. Current synthesis analyzes the Taliban's rule as a contradictory synthesis. Future pathways discusses alternatives to violent transformation. Conclusion summarizes Afghanistan's historical predicament and potential futures. Now let's begin in detail. Afghanistan through a Hegelian lens. Reason, conflict, and the possibility of progress. 1. The Hegelian framework. Understanding historical development. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's philosophy of history presents a compelling framework for understanding Afghanistan's turbulent trajectory. For Hegel, history represents the gradual self-realization of what he termed world spirit, Weltgeist, through a dialectical process of conflict and resolution. This process typically follows a pattern. An existing thesis, established order, generates its antithesis, opposing force, leading to conflict that ultimately produces a synthesis, new, higher order. This synthesis then becomes the new thesis, and the process repeats, driving historical progress. Hegel famously characterized this painful process as history moving forward on what he called the slaughter bench, Schlachtbank of history, where individuals, nations, and ideas are sacrificed for the advancement of human consciousness and freedom. Central to Hegel's theory is the concept of reason, Vernunft, unfolding through history. He argued that despite the apparent chaos and violence of historical events, a rational process is ultimately at work. The only thought which philosophy brings with it is the simple idea of reason. The idea that reason governs the world, and that world history is therefore a rational process. This progress toward greater self-awareness and freedom represents what Hegel called the march of reason through history. However, Hegel viewed non-European societies, particularly what he termed the Oriental world, as being at an earlier stage of historical development, characterized by what he saw as stagnant customs and the absence of subjective freedom, where only the ruler was free and individuals had not yet achieved consciousness of their own liberty. 2. Afghanistan's historical cycles. Repetition without progress. 2.1 Patterns of conflict and external intervention. Afghanistan's modern history presents a compelling case study for Hegelian analysis, having experienced numerous cycles of conflict that seemingly fail to produce a stable synthesis. The country has endured multiple destructive phases: the Soviet invasion, 1979 to 1989, the civil war among Mujahideen factions, 1992 to 1996, the first Taliban regime, 1996 to 2001, the American-led occupation, 2001 to 2021, and the return of the Taliban, 2021, present. Each phase emerged as an antithesis to the previous order, but failed to establish a sustainable synthesis that would advance human freedom and rational governance. The fundamental paradox lies in Afghanistan's simultaneous resistance to and dependence on foreign influence. The country has fiercely defended its independence since gaining sovereignty from Britain in 1919, yet has repeatedly become a battlefield for proxy wars between global powers. This pattern reflects what Hegel might identify as a contradiction within Afghanistan's historical development: the struggle between the desire for authentic self-determination and the reality of geopolitical dependence. The international intervention following 2001 attempted to impose a democratic system, but ultimately failed to establish legitimate authority because it created a centralized state that ignored local structures and traditions, leading to a governance gap between Kabul and the rural populations. 2.2 The challenge of modernization without authentic development. Afghanistan's historical experience with modernization attempts reveals the Hegelian necessity of internal development rather than external imposition. King Amanullah Khan's ambitious reform program, 1919 to 1929, which included establishing Afghanistan's first constitution, opening girls' schools, and emancipating women, initially represented a promising synthesis of Islamic principles with modern governance. However, these reforms were ultimately rejected because they were perceived as externally imposed rather than organically developed from within Afghan society. The rapid pace of change without cultural preparation generated a powerful antithesis in the form of traditionalist backlash, causing the reforms to collapse. This pattern repeated itself during the Soviet-backed regime, 1978 to 1992, and the US-supported Republic, 2001 to 2021. In both cases, modernization efforts were perceived as foreign implants rather than authentic developments emerging from Afghan society itself. The result was what Hegel might characterize as an abstract universal being imposed without regard for particular local conditions. A recipe for failure in his philosophical system. The fundamental error was attempting to implement political changes without first developing the necessary consciousness and institutional frameworks within society. As Hegel argued, genuine historical progress requires that principles become interwoven with the will and its interest, rather than being externally mandated. 3. The current synthesis. Taliban rule as contradictory resolution. 3.1. The Taliban as dialectical outcome. The Taliban's return to power in 2021 represents the latest synthesis emerging from Afghanistan's dialectical struggles, but one fraught with internal contradictions that may contain the seeds of its own destruction. The movement emerged as the antithesis to multiple failed theses: the corruption and fragmentation of the Mujahideen factions, the excesses of Western-style modernization that alienated traditional segments of society, and the perceived moral decay associated with foreign occupation. The Taliban successfully positioned themselves as champions of religious authenticity and national sovereignty against what they portrayed as corrupt foreign impositions. However, the Taliban's Islamic Emirate embodies what Hegel would recognize as a contradictory synthesis. The movement has pragmatically adopted some elements of modern statecraft while rejecting others, creating an unstable amalgam of pre-modern and modern elements. They have preserved governmental infrastructure and bureaucratic structures from the Republic, while imposing their strict interpretation of Sharia law. This creates what Hegel would identify as an internal contradiction between the form of the state, which requires modern administrative functionality, and its content, which rejects the philosophical foundations of modernity. The regime's extreme gender policies, which exclude women from education and public life, fundamentally undermine state capacity by eliminating half the population from productive contribution, a practical contradiction that may prove unsustainable. 3.2 Internal divisions and emerging antitheses. The Taliban regime already shows signs of generating its own antitheses through its internal divisions and governance failures. The movement is fractured along ideological, ethnic, and personal lines, with significant tensions between the pragmatic wing, represented by figures like Abdul Ghani Baradar, and the ideological hardliners, represented by the Haqqani Network and Mullah Yaqub. These divisions reflect what Hegel would understand as the particular interests within the universal claim of Islamic governance, contradictions that must inevitably manifest themselves in political struggle. Additionally, the Taliban face emerging antitheses from multiple directions. Youth resistance, a generation that came of age during the Republic era, 2001 to 2021, has experienced greater freedoms and education, particularly in urban areas. These young Afghans, representing 2/3 of the population, have known alternatives to Taliban rule and may increasingly resist their restrictions. Ethnic and religious minorities, non-Pashtun groups, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and non-Sunni Muslims have been largely excluded from power, creating potential sources of resistance. Islamic State Khorasan, ISK. The ISIS affiliate represents a more extreme antithesis that challenges the Taliban's religious legitimacy from a radical direction. These emerging contradictions suggest that the current synthesis is unstable and likely to generate further conflict, potentially another turn on what Hegel called the slaughter bench of history. 4. Beyond the slaughter bench. Alternative pathways. 4.1. Recognizing historical patterns to avoid pitfalls. Hegel's philosophy suggests that understanding historical patterns can potentially help societies avoid the worst excesses of the dialectical process. He argued that history teaches that peoples and governments never have learned anything from history or acted on principles deduced from it. However, this cynical observation contains within it the possibility that conscious reflection on historical patterns might enable a less destructive path forward. For Afghanistan, this would require recognizing several crucial patterns that have consistently led to conflict. Table: historical patterns in Afghanistan's development and potential alternatives. Historical pattern Hegelian interpretation. Alternative pathways: centralized power, imposed from Kabul abstract, universal imposed without regard for particular local conditions, decentralized governance that respects regional autonomy and traditions, modernization as external imposition, vertical bar thesis and antithesis remain external to each other, preventing true synthesis organic development that integrates modern elements with indigenous cultural frameworks. Exclusion of defeated groups from power, one-sided synthesis that generates immediate antithesis, inclusive political settlement that incorporates diverse ethnic and political groups. Dependence on foreign support, vertical bar failure to achieve genuine self-determination through internal development, balanced international engagement that supports without dominating internal processes. 4.2. The necessity of internal development. The fundamental Hegelian insight for Afghanistan is that lasting progress must emerge organically from within Afghan society rather than being imposed from outside. Hegel criticized attempts to implement abstract principles without regard for historical context and cultural particularity. In his analysis of the Oriental world, he argued that progress occurs when principles become interwoven with the will and its interest, rather than remaining external commandments for Afghanistan. This suggests that successful modernization must embrace education as the means for developing subjective consciousness and individual reasoning capacity, particularly through the education of women, which is essential for comprehensive national development. Develop economic self-sufficiency to reduce dependency on foreign aid and create the material conditions for genuine autonomy. Create inclusive political institutions that recognize Afghanistan's ethnic and religious diversity rather than imposing a monolithic vision. Integrate modern concepts with Islamic principles in ways that feel authentic rather than imported. This process would represent what Hegel called the march of reason within Afghan society, the gradual development of institutions and consciousness that enable greater freedom and self-determination. The alternative is continued cyclical conflict on the slaughter bench of history, where progress is achieved only through catastrophic violence and destruction. 5. Conclusion. Reason, freedom, and Afghanistan's future. Hegel's philosophical framework suggests that Afghanistan's historical tragedies represent not mere chaos, but the painful birth pangs of historical development. The country has indeed been caught in what might be termed a dialectical trap, where each synthesis generates its own contradictions before achieving stability. However, Hegel would likely argue that the slaughter bench is not inevitable. It becomes necessary only when societies fail to consciously apprehend and work through their contradictions through rational reflection and institutional innovation. The fundamental question for Afghanistan is whether it can develop a synthesis that reconciles its Islamic identity with the demands of modern statehood, its tribal particularities with the need for national unity, and its desire for sovereignty with the realities of global interdependence. This would require what Hegel called recognition, anerkennung, between the different elements within Afghan society, an acknowledgement of mutual legitimacy and shared destiny that has thus far been elusive. The Taliban's current synthesis seems unlikely to represent this recognition, as it excludes too many elements of Afghan society and embraces too many contradictions. However, Hegel's philosophy reminds us that historical progress often occurs through apparent regressions that ultimately propel society forward. Even failed syntheses contribute to historical development by revealing contradictions that must be overcome. Afghanistan's path toward reason and freedom remains fraught, and further conflict on the slaughter bench of history may indeed lie ahead. But Hegel's philosophy ultimately offers a cautious optimism, the belief that through the painful working through of contradictions, societies can eventually achieve higher forms of freedom and self-understanding. For Afghanistan, this would mean finding a uniquely Afghan synthesis that honors its traditions while embracing elements of modernity that serve the welfare of its people. The alternative is to remain stuck in what Hegel might see as a prehistorical condition, outside the march of reason that defines world history.